The man who owns everything will still starve if he can't offer love. They say wealth can mask many things: fear, pain, shame. But it can't cover up loneliness, not forever. This story begins with a man who had everything you could buy, and a girl who had nothing but her heart. But before we get in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. High Ridge, Colorado sat nestled between peaks that touched heaven and valleys that whispered secrets. Population 1,231. The kind of place where folks still tipped their hats on Main Street, prayers were said before supper, and reputation stretched longer than shadows at dusk. The morning sun caught the windows of the old Mayfield house, 2 stories of weathered wood and faded paint that had sheltered 3 generations. Inside, 18-year-old Eloise Mayfield sat at her father's bedside, reading aloud from his favorite psalms. She had skin like new porcelain and eyes the color of creek water after spring rain, the kind of beauty that made boys fumble their words and mothers whisper behind church pews. Ernest Mayfield's breathing came shallow and labored. The cancer had carved him hollow over the past year, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him the best welder in the county. For 30 years, he'd worked for Iron Creek Developments, building the infrastructure that brought prosperity to their mountain community. "Eloise, honey," he whispered, his voice like gravel on glass. "Call Mr. Everhart. Tell him it's time." She'd been valedictorian at Clear Creek High just 3 weeks ago, a full scholarship to Colorado State tucked in her graduation folder. But that summer wasn't about dreams or college plans. It was about goodbyes and promises her father had made long before she understood what they meant. Patrick Everhart arrived within the hour, his black Mercedes looking out of place on their gravel drive. At 36, he was the richest man in the county, owned half the mountain and most of the valley below. Self-made from nothing, sharp-minded, and clean-shaven in a way that made folks question if he ever slept. He wasn't movie star handsome, not with that crooked nose broken in a childhood accident and those deep-set eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. But his money wrapped him in polish that made people forget his humble beginnings. Patrick had grown up 3 miles down the mountain in a trailer that leaked when it rained. His father had been a drunk, his mother a saint who died too young. Ernest Mayfield had been the first man to give him steady work at 16, teaching him that honest labor was the foundation of everything worthwhile. Ernest struggled to sit up as Patrick entered the small bedroom. "I want you to marry my girl," he said without preamble, his words carrying the weight of a dying man's final wish. Patrick's hands stilled on his hat brim. "Ernest, She don't know men. Don't know the world beyond these mountains. But I know you. I watched you grow up. I know your heart even if you've forgotten it exists." Ernest's eyes found Eloise, who sat frozen in her chair. "My boys will need guidance when I'm gone. Someone to keep them from making the mistakes their old man made. And Eloise, she needs someone who understands what real love looks like even if it takes time to find it." Eloise looked between the 2 men who were deciding her future. Her brothers Jake and Tommy, 21 and 19 respectively, worked construction jobs that barely kept food on their table. Without their father's steady income, the family would lose everything within months. "I'll provide for them regardless," Patrick said quietly. "You don't need to." "This ain't about charity," Ernest interrupted. "This is about family. About doing right by people who matter." Patrick studied Eloise's face, searching for signs of protest or fear. Instead, he found something that surprised him: acceptance. Not resignation, but the quiet strength of a young woman who understood that sometimes love grew from duty rather than passion. "If she agrees," Patrick said finally. Eloise nodded once, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I agree." 3 days later, Ernest Mayfield was laid to rest in the cemetery overlooking the valley he'd helped build. The following week, Patrick and Eloise were married in the same chapel where her parents had exchanged vows 25 years earlier. She wore her mother's lace dress, yellowed with age but still beautiful. He wore a blue tailored suit that cost more than her father's pickup truck. The ceremony was simple, just family, a few close friends, and the preacher who'd baptized her as a baby. When Patrick kissed her at the altar, it was gentle and brief, the kiss of a man sealing a promise rather than claiming a prize. The Everhart estate sprawled across 60 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, a testament to what determination and ruthless business sense could build. The mansion itself rose like something from a fairy tale, stone and timber construction with 40 rooms, soaring ceilings, and windows that captured the mountain views from every angle. Eloise's first glimpse of her new home left her speechless. The circular driveway could accommodate a dozen cars. The front entrance featured carved double doors that belonged in a European cathedral. Inside, marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings in gilded frames watched from every wall. "Your wing is on the east side," Patrick said, his voice echoing in the grand foyer. "You'll have privacy there. Your own sitting room, library, balcony with mountain views." He led her through halls that seemed to stretch forever, past rooms filled with furniture that looked like museum pieces. Her footsteps clicked against marble, the sound swallowed by the vastness around them. The master suite he'd prepared for her took her breath away. The bedroom alone was larger than her family's entire house. A four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in silk the color of champagne. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the valley. But it was the walk-in closet that made her feel like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. Racks of designer dresses lined the walls, labels she couldn't pronounce in fabrics that felt like water between her fingers. Shoes arranged by color and height filled an entire wall. Jewelry sparkled from velvet-lined drawers. Diamonds, emeralds, pearls that seemed to glow with their own light. "I had my assistants select everything," Patrick said, hovering in the doorway as if uncertain whether to enter. "If anything doesn't fit or you don't like it, we can exchange it." Eloise ran her fingers along a beaded evening gown that probably cost more than her father's annual salary. "Patrick, it's too much." "Nothing's too much for my wife." The word, wife, hung between them, formal and strange. They barely knew each other beyond polite conversations at church socials and community events. Now they were supposed to share a life, a home, a future. Those first weeks passed in careful choreography. Patrick left for his office at 7 each morning, returning promptly at 6 for dinner served by Maria, the housekeeper who'd been with him for 10 years. They ate at opposite ends of a dining table that could seat 20, making conversation about the weather, local news, her online college courses. He was unfailingly polite, generous with his credit cards and patient with her questions about running such a large household. But he maintained a distance that felt deliberate, as if he were afraid that getting too close might break some unspoken agreement between them. At night, when he came to her room, he would always bring something new. A silk nightgown from Paris. A bracelet of tiny diamonds that caught the lamplight. Perfume in crystal bottles that cost more than most people's cars. He would present each gift formally, waiting for her to put it on before he touched her. Their intimacy felt choreographed too, gentle but restrained, as if he were holding back some essential part of himself. He would worship her body with his hands and mouth, bringing her to heights of pleasure she'd never imagined, but he always seemed to be watching her through a lens of beautiful things rather than seeing her. One night, as moonlight painted silver squares across the Persian rug, Eloise found the courage to ask the question that had been building inside her for weeks. "Why are you always hiding behind diamonds, Patrick?" He froze, his hands stilling on the clasp of the emerald necklace he'd brought her. In the mirror's reflection, she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, pain, recognition. He didn't answer. Just finished fastening the necklace and kissed her shoulder before retreating to his own room down the hall. Spring arrived in the Colorado mountains like a whispered promise. Snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers painted the meadows purple and gold, and Eloise began to find her rhythm in the vast mansion that was slowly becoming home. She enrolled in an online interior design program through Denver State, transforming one of the empty rooms into a studio where she could sketch and plan. The house had so much unused space, entire wings that Patrick never entered, rooms filled with dust-covered furniture that hadn't been touched in years. "Why don't you use all these rooms?" she asked one evening over dinner. Patrick glanced up from his salmon, seeming surprised by the question. "I suppose I never needed them. It's just been me here for so long." "How long?" 12 years. I built this place when I was 24, right after the first big development deal went through." He cut another piece of fish, his movements precise. I thought I'd fill it eventually. With a family, with life. But it just stayed empty." Eloise studied his profile in the candlelight, seeing past the expensive haircut and tailored shirt to something lonely underneath. "It doesn't have to stay empty." That weekend, she began what she privately called Operation Resurrection. Room by room, she brought the mansion to life. She moved furniture, hung new curtains, filled vases with wildflowers from the mountain meadows. She baked bread that made the kitchen smell like home and left books open on tables throughout the house. Patrick watched her efforts with something like amazement, as if he'd forgotten that houses could feel warm instead of just impressive. But the breakthrough came on a night when she decided to stop waiting for him to come to her. She dressed herself in red, a simple dress from her old wardrobe, not one of the designer creations he'd bought her. She wore her grandmother's perfume, the one that smelled like cedar and spring rain. She knocked on his bedroom door at 10 o'clock, her heart hammering against her ribs. When he opened the door, something shifted in his expression. The careful politeness cracked, revealing hunger and surprise and something that looked almost like relief. This time, when he pulled her into his arms, there were no gifts, no jewelry, no silk nightgowns. Just his hands in her hair and his mouth on hers with an urgency that made her knees weak. Afterward, as they lay tangled in his sheets with moonlight streaming through the windows, he told her everything. "There was a woman in Chicago," he said, his voice rough with old pain. "Veronica. I met her when I was 25, just starting to make real money. She was beautiful, a model, sophisticated, everything I thought I wanted." Eloise stayed quiet, her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I thought she loved me. For 6 months I thought I'd found everything I'd been working for. Then one night at a party full of her friends she got drunk and told the truth." His arm tightened around her. "She said I was useful. Good for expensive dinners and jewelry and trips to Europe. But that my money was the only attractive thing about me. That without it I was just some mountain trash with crooked teeth and rough hands." Patrick. "So I fixed everything she complained about. Got my teeth straightened, learned which fork to use at fancy restaurants, bought clothes that would make me look like I belonged in her world. But it was never enough. She always found new flaws, new things that needed improving." Eloise lifted her head to look at him. "What happened?" "I finally realized she was right about one thing. I was just buying her affection. So I stopped trying." He touched her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly. "I told myself I'd never make that mistake again. That if someone was going to be with me, it would be because they chose to, not because of what I could give them." "Is that why you married me? Because my father arranged it, so you didn't have to wonder about my motives?" Patrick was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, Maybe. At first. But Eloise, you don't look at me like I'm a bank account with arms. You see something else. I see you, she said simply. The man who still sends anonymous donations to the food bank every month. Who kept my father's old crew employed even when you didn't need them. Who built a playground for the elementary school and pretended it was a tax write-off. He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. How do you know about those things? Small towns have big ears. And you're not as invisible as you think you are. That night, for the first time since their wedding, the mansion didn't echo with emptiness. It hummed with possibility. Mid-spring brought an envelope that changed everything. The return address read Portland Institute of Design, and Eloise's name was printed across the front in formal typeface. She opened it at the kitchen table while Patrick read the morning paper, her coffee growing cold as she scanned the letter twice to make sure she wasn't dreaming. Full scholarship, she whispered. Patrick looked up from the financial section. What's that? She handed him the letter with shaking hands. Portland Institute of Design. They're offering me a full scholarship for their interior design program. It's one of the best schools in the country. Patrick read the letter slowly, his expression unreadable. She watched his face for any sign of what he was thinking. Jealousy, anger, fear. Instead, she saw something that broke her heart. Resignation. You should go, he said finally, folding the letter carefully and handing it back to her. You earned this. Patrick. No, Eloise. This is your dream. Your chance. I won't be the reason you don't take it. She studied his face, seeing the fear he was trying to hide behind noble intentions. What if I don't want to go? You have to want to go. It's Portland. It's everything you've been working toward. But she didn't answer that day. Instead, she drove into town in her old pickup truck, the one Patrick had offered to replace a dozen times. She needed to think, and thinking required familiar surroundings. High Ridge looked smaller than it had 6 months ago, but no less dear. She parked outside Miller's Diner, where she'd waitressed during high school, and waved to Mrs. Chen through the window. She walked past the library where she'd spent countless afternoons reading design magazines, past the elementary school where she'd volunteered as a tutor. Her feet carried her to the children's home on Miller Street, a modest building that housed 12 kids whose families couldn't care for them. She'd been volunteering there since she was 16, reading stories and helping with homework. The director, Mrs. Patterson, greeted her with a warm hug. Eloise, we've missed you. How's married life treating you? It's an adjustment, Eloise admitted. Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something? How do you know when you're making the right choice? The older woman studied her with kind eyes. Well, honey, I found that the right choice usually isn't the easy one. But it's the one that lets you sleep at night, knowing you're where you're supposed to be. That afternoon, Eloise loaded her truck with 10 boxes of books and art supplies, gifts from Patrick's seemingly endless resources. She spent the rest of the day at the children's home, reading stories and teaching the kids to paint watercolor flowers. 8-year-old Sarah, who rarely spoke due to trauma from her past, tugged on Eloise's sleeve as the afternoon wound down. Miss Eloise, are you going away like the other ladies? What other ladies, sweetie? The ones who come to help but then leave when something better comes along. Eloise knelt down to Sarah's level, looking into eyes that had seen too much disappointment for someone so young. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. This is my home. These are my people. That night, she curled up beside Patrick in his bed, her decision crystallizing like mountain air in winter. I'm staying, she said without preamble. Patrick went very still. The scholarship. I can study online. I can build a practice here in the mountains. There are plenty of wealthy folks moving to Colorado who need someone to help them make their houses into homes. She propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "I'm not going anywhere, Patrick." "Why?" The word came out raw, vulnerable. "Because I married you for Daddy. But I'm choosing to love you for me." He stared at her as if she'd just handed him the moon. "You love me?" "I love the man who remembers every employee's birthday, who stocks the food bank anonymously, who built a playground because he thought kids should have somewhere beautiful to play." She touched his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of stubble. "I love the man who hides his generous heart behind expensive suits because someone once told him his kindness wasn't enough." Patrick's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for 15 years. "I don't deserve you." Good thing love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. And I choose you, Patrick Everhart. Every day I choose you. Summer returned to the Colorado mountains like an old friend, painting the valley in shades of green and gold. The Everhart mansion bloomed with life in ways that had nothing to do with the professionally maintained gardens. Children's laughter echoed through halls that had been silent for over a decade. Eloise had convinced Patrick to host monthly charity events, fundraisers for the children's home, the food bank, the volunteer fire department. The mansion's ballroom, closed off and gathering dust for years, became the heart of community gatherings. Patrick, who had once hidden behind his wealth, began to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. He taught woodworking classes for teenage boys who needed father figures. He funded a scholarship program for local kids pursuing trade skills. He even convinced the town council to approve funds for a new community center. The man who had once calculated every interaction began to laugh more freely, smile more often, touch his wife with hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty. One evening in late July, as they sat on the balcony watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold, Patrick asked the question that had been growing in his heart. "What did you want back then? When all this began, when your father made his request, what did you actually want for yourself?" Eloise leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and summer air. Below them, the valley spread like a patchwork quilt, dotted with lights from houses where families were sharing dinner and bedtime stories. "Not jewels," she said quietly. "Not gowns or mansions or trips to Paris." She looked up at him, her creekwater eyes reflecting the first stars of evening. "I wanted to matter. To someone, to something bigger than myself. I wanted to know that my life had purpose, that the choices I made would ripple out and touch other lives in good ways." Patrick felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so profound it took his breath away. "And do you matter?" She smiled, and in that smile he saw the girl who had accepted his proposal out of duty and the woman who had chosen to love him out of hope. "Yes. I matter to the kids at the children's home who have someone who shows up consistently. I matter to you, in ways that have nothing to do with what you can buy me. I matter to this community that's becoming more connected because we're opening our doors." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "And you matter too, Patrick. Not because of your money or your success, but because of your heart. The heart you've been hiding for so many years." The mansion stretched around them, 40 rooms that had once felt like a beautiful prison. Now it felt like what Patrick had always intended it to be, a home. Not just for him, not just for Eloise, but for everyone who needed a place to belong. As fireflies began to dance in the meadow below and the mountains settled into their ancient silence, Patrick understood what his father-in-law had known all along. Love wasn't something you could buy or earn or negotiate. It was something you chose, day after day, in small acts of kindness and large gestures of faith. The man who had hidden behind diamonds had finally learned to shine with his own light. And the girl who had married for duty had discovered that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from choosing to stay. The man who owns everything will still starve if he can't offer love. But Patrick Everhart learned something that night under the Colorado stars. Love isn't about what you can give someone. It's about seeing them clearly enough to know what they actually need. He'd spent years trying to buy affection, trying to polish himself into someone worthy of love. But Eloise didn't need his diamonds or his mansion or his carefully curated perfection. She needed him to matter. And in helping her find her purpose, he discovered his own. The mansion never shrank. But it no longer felt too big. Because finally, it was filled with the one thing money couldn't buy. A love that chose to grow deeper instead of just looking prettier. Sometimes the most precious things in life aren't the ones that sparkle. They're the ones that stay. If this story stirred something inside you, hit subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that matter. And tell me in the comments, what do you think is the one thing love can't live without?